for later viewing or other people who want to view this event at a later time. This event was scheduled to take place in person outdoors, but due to the weather conditions, it's much safer in here, a lot drier, a lot warmer as well. We want to thank both candidates for agreeing to come out tonight and for doing so in person. Due to the indoor setting, we wanted to make sure both candidates were comfortable talking without their masks. And so right before the event, we did have everyone show proof of vaccination, and we had everyone take a rapid test to ensure everyone was negative as well. Before we hear from our candidates, I'd like to go over the details for tonight. Each candidate will have 3 minutes to give their opening statement. After the statements are given, there will be a total of up to a dozen questions that will be asked of each candidate. The questions will be the same for each candidate. Each candidate will have up to 5 minutes to answer each question. There will be a reminder or a person in the back giving out the times to remind them as to the time limit. And at the end, each candidate will have 2 minutes to give closing remarks to close out the evening's event. We drew names earlier, and the person who will go first will be Alana Mathews. And first, we'd like to have her begin with opening statements at this time.
Thank you. Good evening. Last year, we experienced an unprecedented number of protests across the country, fueled by a criminal justice system that is struggling in the 21st century to achieve equal justice under the law. My name is Alana Mathews, and I'm a candidate for district attorney, and I'm running for this office to offer new leadership and new solutions to modernize our criminal legal system. I am running to ensure the safety and security of all communities remains a top priority, while at the same time working to restore community trust in our law enforcement and criminal legal system. I began my legal career as a district attorney in Sacramento, where I learned firsthand the work that prosecutors do in the community is just as important as the work in the courtroom. As a survivor of gun violence, racial violence, and even domestic violence, I will bring a fresh new perspective to the district attorney's office that fosters not only protecting lives, but transforming them. I spent 8 years successfully prosecuting violent offenders, and at the same time, I mentored women on parole and at-risk youth to help them build better pathways to a better future. As a former prosecutor, having tried numerous jury and court trials, I know and understand the work of the DA's office, and I'm qualified to lead it. My qualifications extend beyond the work of the district attorney's office. I was appointed public advisor of the California Energy Commission by then Governor Jerry Brown, and was later appointed a chief consultant for the California legislature by the Speaker of the Assembly. In these two positions, I gained valuable experience as an executive leader, driving organizational change and successfully implementing new laws and policies, building collaborative relationships at the highest level of state government. I will take this skill set with me into the office of the district attorney to advocate for additional resources, build collaborative relationships, and support policies aimed at protecting all of our residents. My priority as district attorney will be to promote public safety, be a better manager of resources, and focusing on violent crimes and felonies. This means working with law enforcement, elected officials, and community partners to find alternatives to incarceration for individuals experiencing severe mental health, substance abuse, and even homelessness. It is time for a new change and a new leader in the office of the district attorney. One is focused on community, bringing to our community common sense solutions committed to the fundamental principles of equal justice under the law. It's time to protect all victims. We can no longer normalize crime in certain neighborhoods against certain types of people. And it's time to ensure we have a fair legal system that holds anyone who breaks the law accountable, no matter what position they hold, how much money they have, or what uniform they wear. It's time to elect a new leader with an independent voice. I am that new change, and I am that leader. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Alana. Now it's Tim Ho's opportunity to make an opening statement.
I'm running for district attorney because the people of Sacramento deserve the steady hand of a veteran prosecutor with a proven track record to protect the public and ensure equal justice for all. I have the experience in the courtroom, the executive room, the classroom, and in the community. The position of district attorney isn't about slick slogans or catchy phrases. And we cannot leave public safety in inexperienced and unproven hands. In the courtroom, I was assigned to the Special Victims Unit, where I prosecuted child molesters and serial rapists. I also served time prosecuting gang members in the Gang and Hate Crimes Unit, prosecuting gang members who committed murders in broad daylight. And I was assigned to the Homicide Unit, where I prosecuted the most notorious serial killer in the state's history, the Golden State Killer. Expertise is gained through experience. And I've been a prosecutor for over 20 years. In the executive room, I have managed, supervised, or directed over 100 prosecutors. As a member of the hiring committee and the executive team at the district attorney's office, I have recruited, hired, and promoted prosecutors. As an executive team member and an assistant chief at the DA's office, I have managed and shaped a budget of $85 million for a prosecutor's office. In the classroom, I've been an adjunct professor in the George School of Law, where I teach trial and advocacy for the last 15 years. My students have won countless awards for advocacy on a national level, and many of them are prosecutors in Sacramento. Additionally, in the community, I have co-founded the Voices for Victims Coalition, which advocates on behalf of victims. I've collaborated with community-based organizations to combat hate crimes. And additionally, I work with Mervyn Brookins and Gina Warren from brother to brother and sister to sister to divert people away from the pipeline to our prison system. Not only do I have the qualifications to be the next DA, I also have the right perspective to be the people's prosecutor. I'm an immigrant and a refugee. I know what it's like to learn a new language. I know what it's like to own nothing but the clothes on your back. I know what it's like to be afraid of the government. I've walked in your shoes. I've felt and believed in your dreams and your belief. Together, we will build a district attorney's office that ensures public safety for everyone and equal justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. And now we go into our questions. These questions were developed by members of the community. And so in your opening statements, you've addressed a lot of these questions in general, and we want to delve a little bit deeper into some of the issues that you already mentioned. First of all, this next question goes to Tim. Can you cite some personal or family experience beyond your career experiences that would influence how you operate the office of the district attorney?
Most definitely. I was born in Vietnam, and I've been shaped by my experiences. My grandmother was executed by the communists in Vietnam without a judge, without a jury, without a prosecutor present. My uncle was taken away to a re-education camp without due process of law. I've lived in a country without justice. I've lived in a country without the rule of law. I've lived in a country without freedom. And so can we do better in our criminal justice system in America? Absolutely. But we should have reasonable reform, not reckless reform. Coming to this country, I've also, in the years since then, been empathetic to communities that have an immigrant population or a population that do not trust the government. And my community is one of those communities. So over the years, I have worked really hard to make sure that the district attorney's office serve all communities, make sure that we serve all communities equally and with justice. I've been a victim of a drive-by shooting. I've been a victim of an attempted home invasion robbery. I've been a victim of hate. And so I've walked in the shoes of many victims. And so one of the things that is really important to our criminal justice system is to make sure that victims of crime, especially violent crimes, children and women and people from vulnerable and marginalized communities, that their voices are heard. Because justice should be for all communities, not just certain communities. And we want to make sure that the voices of victims are heard. They're heard in the courtroom, they're heard in the council chamber, and they're heard in the chamber of both legislatures. And so it's really important, based upon my history and my family's history, that we have justice that represents everyone equally and that we protect the rights of victims, which is something that I've done over and over again as a 20+ year prosecutor.
Thank you. And Alana, the same question, family, personal experiences, along with career experiences that would color your duties, and how you carry out your duties with the district attorney's office.
Thank you. Well, I would start with the fact that I'm from Gary, Indiana, which is a high crime area. It was there when I was the victim of a drive-by shooting as well. And then I had an opportunity because my parents, I grew up in a union household. They told me the best way to build a better life was through my education. So I had the opportunity to go to a college prep school. But unfortunately, when I was there, I was accosted by a group of angry white boys yelling racial epithets at me, and was a victim of racial crime. And then later in life, I also was a victim of domestic violence. So having all of those experiences, I think what's most important to note is that no perpetrator was ever held accountable. And so we often talked about serving and protecting victims, but we forget about the ones who don't see justice in the courtroom. And many people, especially during the time of COVID, have underreported crimes. Individuals who are from immigrant and refugee communities don't feel comfortable precisely because they come from countries where there's corruption in police. And also, they're just people who distrust the legal system, and they don't know how, or they are just concerned that they would not put their loved ones or someone, even if they've hurt them, they don't want to have them subject to either deportation consequences or other consequences. So that has shaped how I deal and understand victims. I would also say that my experience in the community, it's not something that I've done because it's been my job title. It's at the core of who I am. And so even when I was a district attorney, I mentored women on parole. Phyllis Gonzalez, I helped her make a transition. She was a repeat drug offender, and I helped her get her life back together and gain control of her children. I've also spent the last 10 years mentoring at-risk youth and leading the Foreign Law Academy program, where that relationships that I've built with those students has not only kept them out of crime, but my very first mentee was sworn into the bar as an attorney in the California State Bar. And my second mentee, Deepak Kumar, will be graduating and studying for the bar. So it's something that I have continued. During the pandemic, when I learned that a lot of expungement clinics are closed down, I started the Community Justice Collaborative. I've served as the most recent past president of the Girl Scouts of Central Valley, where I worked with young women in juvenile hall to have a troop out there. I've also volunteered in a number of organizations. I was a volunteer attorney for WEED, because when I see a need in the community, I step up and I take care of it. So it's not something about what I plan to do. I can give extensive examples of what I've already done. And most recently, when I was in the adjunct professor at McGeorge, I designed a class, not just to teach my students, but to connect them to the community. So I was working on alternatives to 911. I was working on dealing with a homeless problem that we have with Sacramento Housing Alliance, and looking at the problems that we have with affordability for those who are newly homeless, and looking at breaking down the barriers for those who are at risk of being homeless. I also work with community grassroots organizations like JUICE to help them have more thoughtful and more informed community engagement, so I could take them from protest to policy to practice. I also work with the NAACP, helping them bring legal services to underserved communities. So I won't be the candidate who will tell you about how I plan to tackle some of the challenges facing it. I'm the candidate who can tell you I've already been doing it.
Thank you, Alana. This next question is for you. And it's been 10 years since we've had a new Sacramento County District Attorney, so an opportunity for a new start for whoever is elected. Can you tell us 3 priorities that you have once you get into office, and how would you implement those priorities as soon as you are sworn in?
Well, because I've been so involved in community work, I think it is imperative to work with the community. That is where your witnesses are. That's where crime happens. So we have to elevate the voice. And I have a community-centered platform that I would introduce to the Sacramento DA's office. There's a community prosecution unit. I would expand that. So they're not just focusing on quality of life crimes, but they're actually a strategic unit, a multidisciplinary unit of embedded prosecutors, investigators, and law enforcement who are looking at trends in the neighborhoods to help them target and find out what solutions could be. I also think we should have a youth court. When I was in the DA's office, it was something that we proposed, but that's a way to not only help youth become have different roles in deciding the cases of their peers. Of course, it would be under the supervision of a judge, but they would also hear cases, so that's a way of diverting young people who commit low-level or first-time offenses away from the justice system and involve them in their peers. And then lastly, I would have community courts that would give, again, an opportunity to divert first-time and low-level offenders to a panel of their peers. When I went to law school, I stayed an extra year and did an LLM, and I got a master's in what I studied my thesis on was restorative justice. And so that's a big part of it. I studied the Chacha courts of Rwanda, and I would bring that to the Sacramento County DA's office. And the reason I would do that is because it's important not only to have accountability, but to have rehabilitation and have individuals face the community where they have maybe caused harm to commit to not continuing that harm. I would also want to make sure that we improve the culture. I know that there has been a recent complaint that was filed against a gay employee who was there. So I want to make sure we build an inclusive work environment. As an implicit bias instructor, that's what I teach, implicit bias in the law. I've also created facilitations and trainings for other lawyers and elected officials. I would make sure that we are ensuring that our DA's office is not perpetuating the disparities that are so profound in our criminal justice system, but we're safeguarding against it. And I would also improve transparency. So I need to add that one more thing. I would add a data dashboard so that we understand how we are charging and who and what we're charging.
Thank you. The 10-second question, priorities, 3 priorities at least, and how would you implement them in when?
Most definitely. So the first priority that I would have, and I have to admit I'm a bit of a nerd. Some people like to talk about music or sports. I like to talk about policy issues. But more importantly, I like to talk about solutions. And so the first policy issue or concern and priority I would focus on is public safety. Public safety is of vital importance to our community. What we have is a 233% increase in drive-by shootings in the county. FBI statistics have shown that from 2020 to 2021, the national homicide rate has increased by the greatest margin in the last 100 years, ever since records were kept. Additionally, homicide rates have increased in Sacramento by over 30%. Gun violence has increased in Sacramento. So one of the policy solutions I would come up with is create a crime strategies unit. That unit would specifically take data from law enforcement agencies and analyze that data to make it more effective in terms of identifying trends in gun violence, in gang violence, and rampant theft, and be able to strategize and come up with solutions to combat those particular issues that affect all communities. The second priority that I would have is tackling the homeless crisis situation that we have. This is an epidemic that we are facing, whether you're in South Sac or East Sac, whether you're in Old Town or downtown. It is something that is affecting our community. You know, if you were to walk down the street and you happen to see somebody and their arm was cut open, you would stop and treat them. But when we have somebody going through a mental health crisis and they happen to be unhoused, a lot of people walk by. We can't let that happen anymore. The homeless crisis is in large part about mental health and drug addiction. Yes, affordable care, affordable housing is a component to it, but we need to address the mental health and drug addiction issue as well. And so we have a program at the district attorney's office that deals with and collaborates with the court, with the defense bar, to try to divert people who have committed crimes, who are unhoused, who are in the homeless population, so we can get the mental health and drug addiction. We need to have increased funding so we can have more bed and treatment facilities so that we can treat the mental health and drug addiction and get people back into a place in their lives where they can have transitional housing. You know, Ms. Mathews talked about the community prosecution and how they need to be embedded within the community and how they need to talk to the community to address. Well, I actually oversee the community prosecution unit. That's within my bureau as an assistant chief. And I can say confidently that we have community prosecutors that are already embedded within the community, that are already collaborating and speaking with the community and collaborating with to find out how we can best serve the community, whether it's on human trafficking, whether it's on gang violence, whether it's on gun violence, whether it's on hate crime violence. For example, our community prosecutors will be conducting a program in South Sacramento in immigrant communities in the next few months to talk about educate them about the dangers of robberies that occurred during the holidays. So that's something that we already do and will continue to do in the CPU community prosecution unit. I'm also going to go ahead and not only build bridges with all communities, I'm actually going to be the bridge with those communities. I want to start an advisory council of people from diverse communities so that we spend time to listen to leaders in diverse communities. It's important to not only be at the table, but to have a voice at that table. Otherwise, you're just there to be seen. So it's important to be heard and to have that voice and to have the input. So these are the things that I see as a priority and that we're continuing to do. And we're talking about alternative courts and diverting people away from the criminal justice system. Some people don't know this or don't want you to know this, but we actually have 14 different alternative courts that we are already employing in the district attorney's office: mental health treatment court, drug DUI treatment court, veterans court. The list goes on and on and on. And I'm going to expand them, especially in the misdemeanor mental health court, because that's going to help us deal with some of the quality of life crimes that affect all communities. And that's what we're going to be doing. That's what we do. And that's what we will continue to do. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Tim. Next question is for you to begin. Hate crimes have affected many of our communities. And of course, the frustration is that it's very difficult to basically identify hate crime. There's so many requirements that have come into play before an action like that can even be charged. Now, how would you address hate crimes in the future with regard to resources, policies, and action, and to have people even report hate crimes because their frustration is so high that nothing is actually done?
First of all, someone who has actually experienced hate and had to deal with that on a personal basis, it's something that is very close to my heart. I see hate crimes in the last year and a half increase, not only in the Asian American community, but in all communities, the LGBTQ, in the trans community, in the African American community, the Latino community, in our religious communities as well. And so Nelson Mandela once said this. He said that people must be taught to hate. And if they can be taught to hate, they can be taught to love, because love comes more naturally to the human heart. So I think the first thing that we really need to do is we need to start an ethnic studies program that is mandatory in our high schools, in our junior high, to be able to educate people about different cultures. Because with that tolerance, with that understanding, we'll have less likelihood of hate crimes. So before you can intervene, you need to educate, and then you intervene. And then what else can you do? Okay, because there are things that we can do, but there are things that I have already done. And I want to talk about some of those things that I have done in the community. So as part of outreach in the community to deal with hate crimes, I've spent time, whether it was with the Wong community or the Mien community or other communities, on the streets with boots on the ground to educate our community about the difference between a hate crime and a hate incident, to talk about the importance of reporting hate incidents and hate crimes so that we have proper statistics, so that the police can get involved and be able to stop and intervene and prevent and deter hate crimes. And I've done that. I've worked with community-based organizations to do that exact same thing. Additionally, I've spent time escorting our elders. Safety on Stockton Boulevard had a program, and I know Elk Grove had a program as well, where we were escorting our elders, whether it was from the store or a community center or somewhere else, to their cars to make sure that they feel safe. In addition, we have developed a program on our website at the district attorney's office where people can report hate crimes, and an investigator monitors that every single day. I also want to start a coalition for tolerance, where we bring together community organizers, where we bring together organizations, where we bring together law enforcement and community leaders so that we can do outreach and education with all communities to make sure that we try to prevent and intervene on hate crimes. And that's something that not only have I been involved in the past, it's something that we are going to do in this county. So it's a particular subject that is close to my heart. We've done a lot, I've done a lot, and I will continue to do a lot for all communities regarding hate crimes and hate incidents. And as the former supervisor of the hate crime unit. I've actually lectured on law enforcement. I've lectured on prosecutors across the state and across the country regarding hate crimes. And how do you go ahead and prosecute hate crimes? So I am a subject matter expert on the area, but I'm also a person that works day in and day out in the community to combat hate crimes against all our communities.
Thank you. Alana, the same question. How would you address the hate crime issue in regards to resources, policies, and actions?
Thank you. So I think the alarming rate of the increase of hate crimes and hate incidents in this country requires that all of our elected leaders aggressively hold offenders accountable. You know, I have been involved in this, and I just shared my personal experience when I was younger and I was in high school. And I remember my parents telling me, you know, you kind of escaped the gang violence in Gary, and we didn't send you to Muncie, Indiana to face racial violence. And it was a transformative moment to either go back home or stay. And I didn't have anyone to stand up for me because my administration told me, well, you shouldn't be walking alone by yourself in the middle of the day. So I had to stand up for myself. And I believe that what we need to do to address hate crimes, other than holding those who commit those, aggressively prosecuting that and holding them accountable, is that we just need to stand up where we are. And we need a leader who's going to model that. So I'm not looking to start a new coalition. We have a number of coalitions, and having been on the front line of all of these incidences, rather than building something new and say, hey, come be a part of this, I'd rather, as a DA, go to those organizations that are already on the ground, such as the API Regional Network, or I believe API Liberation Movement, Agents for Black Lives, the Japanese Alliance that's on Florin Road, other organizations who have been on the front lines addressing this hate crime, is I would go to them and say, how can I support you? Because what normally happens, because there's so much distrust in the criminal legal system, and because we haven't aggressively prosecuted. I know a lot of people that I've talked to, they refer back to the white nationalist protests that happened in 2016, where 9 people were stabbed, and only 1 person was held accountable for knocking someone unconscious with a metal tube or some kind of tube that they had. So what I'm finding is that people don't report it. My own friend, Lisa Salinas, when she experienced a hate incident of somebody yelling racial epithets and hitting her with a buggy at the grocery store, you know, she didn't want to report it at first. She just decided, like, I'll just ignore it, or maybe that would draw more attention to me and make me the subject or even more hate. And so it was a moment where I was able to stand up with her and not do something big and formal or performative, but really just say, okay, if you're going to go to your city council, Woodland, and say, hey, adopt a resolution, give me the number. Let's all call in and let's stand in solidarity, so that we know that this is not just an Asian hate, it's a human hate. And you will have African Americans and Latinos and everybody coming together. So that's the approach that I would take. And that's the approach I already did. When we had hate incidents in Elk Grove, I led the first town hall, racial reconciliation town hall, where we dealt with the difficult conversations of people finally having a chance that their voice could be heard, because they didn't feel heard by the district attorney's office, and they didn't feel heard about from law enforcement to say what incidences of hate have they experienced. And we actually kicked off the city of Elk Grove's No Place for Hate campaign. And then recently, earlier this year, Mayor Bobby Singh came to me and said, okay, we have an increase in incidents in hate crime, API hate crimes. We had incidences in Elk Grove. She said, will you lead a healing circle? So it's not because I have put myself out to necessarily be an expert. It's just because I've worked in the community, standing up for people the way I wish someone could have stood up for me. And that's what I will continue to do. And that's the type of county that I want to inspire. We shouldn't have to have a formal process to teach people the basic, decent human right of love and respect, but we have to model that. And if we are showing othering and distancing in the way we deal with people who are criminal offenders, of course, the most serious and violent offenders have to be held accountable. But those with mental health, substance abuse, if we're not showing compassion there, if we're not showing an ability to not other them, but see how we can really help them, it carries over. And when you build a fence, you are locking people out instead of bridging people. And so that's one of the key steps that's not maybe big and formal, but it's small steps that builds an environment where we're both respecting, loving, and not encouraging hate.
Thank you. And the next question is for you. In recent years, there have been several high-profile law enforcement shootings and use of force shootings that have been investigated by the district attorney's office. And oftentimes those investigations take 8 months, a year or more. Of course, when an ordinary citizen is charged with a crime, it's done very quickly, and the district attorney determines whether a crime has been committed sometimes within days or sooner. And there is a perception that the district attorney's office is favoring law enforcement, giving them a break in terms of investigating it more thoroughly, so to speak. How do you combat that perception? Is it the fact that these kinds of incidents are generally complicated and need more time, or should there be more transparency and immediacy? And along with that, what is your relationship with law enforcement, and would that affect how those kinds of cases are investigated?
So let me first start and back up, because those that I've talked to in the community that express distrust in the system, it's not because of the length of the prosecution. It's because they see on video horrific, tragic incidences, and they wonder, why is there no law enforcement officer being held accountable? There was a paradigm shift after the George Floyd trial, where you actually saw an officer being brought up on charges and a break in command, breaking down that blue wall of silence and having colleagues and superiors come in and say, you know what, this is not how we taught Mr. Schubert. He was not taught to do that. This is not how he was trained. This is not our department policy. So with regard to cases here in Sacramento, there are some cases like the Stephon Park. I'm just going to be open and put it out there. I haven't made any decisions. I get asked about that case all the time. I haven't made any decisions or any commitments that I'm going to reopen that case. But what I have done is been very vocal in saying the Joseph Mann case needs to be investigated. That was an incident where it showed on the camera that officers chased this man down. And then after they chased him down, they immediately got out of their car and they shot him. And we have to have a leader that's not going to turn a blind eye to what we all see with our own two eyes. We can see that. And the way I've tried to work to instill confidence, because I don't want the community thinking, oh, well, this takes longer, so that must mean it's not as fair. I want them to have confidence that when I make a decision, it's based on the law and the facts. So I have not taken any money. I'm saying I am not accepting money from any police units. And I'm doing that to make sure I enforce and strengthen the integrity of our legal system. So if I do, as a prosecutor, have to make a choice, and I'm sure, I mean, not as a prosecutor, as a DA, I'm sure I would have to make a decision sometimes that the use of force is justified. But the community can have confidence that that decision is based on facts and the merit, and not because I'm getting political contribution. It is important to have prosecutorial independence. If you want to hold anybody accountable, no matter what position they hold or the money that they make or the uniform they wear, you have to have prosecutorial independence. So why complicate that by saying, oh, well, let me have a political contribution? Because that's immediately what the community thinks is, oh, they're too cozy. They have a cozy relationship. They're contributing a lot of money to your campaign, so you're going to owe them a favor. Whether or not that's the truth, that is the perception, and that is what the community plays out. And that's why I have made that commitment. I have a great relationship with law enforcement. I've worked with them for 8 years. When I was a prosecutor in that office, I still have many who I am friends with, and we see each other socially. But doing my job, I believe it is very important to have prosecutorial independence. So when a decision is made, the community doesn't blow up. The community is not upset because they finally have a leader, someone who believes that officers who break the law should be held accountable.
Thank you, Alana. The same question for you, Tim. Your relationship with law enforcement, investigating shootings in the process, and how it should be handled by the district attorney's office.
Thank you. Both Ms. Mathews and myself have recently interviewed for the endorsement of the Deputy Sheriff's Association here in Sacramento. Fact of the matter is I told the Deputies Association and I've told law enforcement again and again, and also members of the community this. I've told them that I'm going to follow as a district attorney and as a prosecutor where the facts and the law takes me. Wherever the facts and the law take me, I am going to go there. And so if the facts and law indicate that a police officer needs to be held accountable, they are going to be held accountable. It doesn't matter whether somebody's on probation or whether they're a police officer. It doesn't matter whether they're wearing blue jeans or a blue uniform. If you break the law, you will be held accountable. It's as simple as that. And I will follow the facts and the law where that takes us. That is the oath that a prosecutor takes. And this office, the district attorney's office, we prosecuted officers for excessive use of force. We prosecuted officers for crimes such as domestic violence, perjury, for violent crimes. So we hold officers accountable, and we will continue to do so when the facts and the law dictate so. We're not going to have politics guide our actions. We're going to be guided by the facts and the law. And I will continue to do that again and again and again, because that's how it's supposed to work in a system of justice with the rule of law in place.
Thank you. And Jen, a question for you. How do you feel about defunding police or reassigning police resources to other programs and avenues that might either relieve the responsibility of police or simply a different strategy in having certain kinds of crimes?
I'm against defunding the police. I am against defunding the police. When you look at the statistics, violent crime disproportionately affects communities of color. They affect the Latino community, the African American community, the Asian community disproportionately. So when you're defunding the police, when you're taking away resources from the police, you're taking away resources from victims of crimes who happen to belong to communities of color and marginalized communities. As somebody, as I mentioned earlier, who has experienced violent crime, a drive-by shooting, an attempted home invasion robbery by gang members, and hate incidents, I understand the impact that violent crime has on all communities. And if you look at whether it's gang violence, you look at whether it's gun violence, the people that are the victims of those crimes are often people in those communities. And if we take away the police, if we take away the resources from the police, what's going to happen is that those communities are going to be disproportionately and negatively affected. We don't need less police, we need more and better policing. That's what we need. So I'm against defunding the police. It does not work. It has not worked, and it will not work.
Thank you. The same question for you. The clamor among some people in the community for defunding the police or at least rerouting budgeting toward other programs.
So let me start by stepping back and talking about this defund the police and put it in context. If your lived experience has been that the police represent safety and security, when you're talking about defunding, you're talking about taking away someone's safety and security. If your lived experience with police has been harassment or unfairness or violence, then you're talking about defunding that. So I think it's important to understand the context when you talk about that phrase, because what's most important is not how we answer that question, but how we approach and listen to the community. So what the community is saying is that I want to be safe. You know, that's a word that is very defining, and that is very divisive. And I'm not a leader who leads by issues because of dividers. I lead by my values. My values are safety, fairness, and justice. So that's what I would start with. Every community wants to be safe. So I want to be the type of leader that's going to listen to the community and say what will make you safe. We are not, I would agree, at a place in our society where we can completely defund the police. But what I will say is I support non-policing alternatives to mental health, substance abuse, and other issues. When I talk to my community partners that are from immigrants and refugee communities, safety for them it hasn't have anything to do with crime. It's about not feeling vulnerable, being able to get on public transportation, without someone to care for me. It's about being able to go shopping and not feeling like I'm going to be vulnerable and taken advantage of because I don't have anyone who can translate for me. So it's important that we listen to communities and understand what and how they define what safety is. And we have non-policing alternatives to address that. So the value, I think, in answering this question is not in which side you choose, whether you're for defunding or not defunding or getting involved in the political language, but it's in the experience. The value of that is in valuing both experiences that anybody in the community has. Valuing those experiences and creating a system where you're responding to that. So you want to know what makes a person feel safe, what makes them feel just, what makes them feel like there is a fair and just legal system that they can participate in. And then lastly, I think we ought to be responsible stewards. As a DA, I want to make sure the investments that we have in our county, we're getting a return on that investment. And so if it's over policing or policing hasn't made the communities more safe, if you can't show a measurable outcome that gang violence has been reduced in the community because of more police presence, you can't show that homicides have gone down because of police presence, but you're seeing there's a continual increase in crime, which I just believe my opponent said there's been 233% in drive-by shootings, 38%. So those investments haven't worked. And then you just look at the fact of communities that don't have a lot of policing. Why is that? It's not because those communities are affluent and they are more white. Communities of color who happen to be the same communities that have more divestment. They have less economic opportunity. So we can't be one-dimensional and just react to crime. We have to be multidimensional and look at prevention and intervention strategies and show what ways can we invest. One of the greatest causes to reduce recidivism is having a job. So that's what we can do in communities, especially when people are re-entering, is to make sure we have economic opportunity. Make sure people have health care, because if I have mental health issues, now I have insurance where I can go see somebody who can help me and help me with my mental health. If I'm having stress, or if I have educational opportunities, I have an opportunity to work with individuals, improve my situation, and work out my way out of poverty. And that's what I learned firsthand when I mentored my mentee who was on parole, and I worked with at-risk youth to create changes and build pathways out of poverty. So I will be the DA who won't be one-dimensional and reactive to crime. I will have prevention and intervention strategies to make sure we reduce the root causes of crime.
Thank you, and we'll begin our next question with you, Alana. District attorneys have a lot of prosecutorial discretion in charging crimes or dismissing them or reducing charges in the interest of justice. How would you balance rehabilitation with punishment in the DA's office?
Thank you for saying that. Again, I don't lead with issues, I lead with values. And one of my values is accountability. So some people equate accountability to punishment, but I think accountability is more rehabilitative. It has to have that opponent, number one, so that any offender acknowledge the crime that they have committed, the harm that they have caused. They need to express remorse for the crime that they have caused and commit to not causing more harm in the future. So I think making sure that we have that rehabilitative structure is important. Focusing on the data, it shows us that when you send someone off to prison, now there are some people, I have to always go back and say this, the most violent and serious offenders, they have to be separated from society. But when we do that, they go off to prison and we never know what happens. So we want to build in as much as possible an opportunity, again, to have prevention and intervention strategies and not just be reactive. So the way I would combat what seems to be competing issues is to create a culture of justice in the DA's office and not a culture of conviction, which means you won't be promoted based on the number of trials you've had, the number of guilty verdicts that you had. But there's a multidimensional so that every deputy, when they're looking at cases, it's not a transaction for a win, but it's an opportunity for justice. And what does that mean? Does that mean that there are underlying issues of mental health, substance abuse, or other issues that might be going on, chronic trauma, that can be addressed so that that person can be held accountable? Or is it a crime that has caused so much harm in the community? We absolutely need to separate them from society for a period of time, because that is what accountability means for that person.
Thank you, Alana. Tim, same question, prosecutorial discretion and how do you balance rehabilitation with incarcerating people for the safety of the community?
Most definitely. So there are words like culture, values. Those words are buzzwords. What policy issue, what definitive steps are going to be taken where you're going to balance public safety and rehabilitation at the same time? So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to provide some substance rather than just form or buzzwords. There is something that we're doing right now in the district attorney's office that I want to talk to people about. We work with Mervyn Brookins and Brother to Brother, and we work with Gina Warren, who works in the Wellness Foundation in Del Paso Heights. What they do is they identify people, they've worked through their program, through the healing circle, to counseling and steps, so that we can identify those individuals and divert those individuals who have experienced intergenerational trauma and toxicity in their lives, so that we can divert them away from the prison system. And we're doing that very thing. So there's a lot that we're doing and we're working within the community already. But what else can we do? Well, we need to be able to really focus on the alternative courts in terms of making sure that we deal with mental health and drug addiction. But at the same time, when you are an individual who have committed violent crimes, whether it's child molestation, whether it's rape, whether it's homicide, we need to hold those individuals accountable. Even if you are a juvenile. If you are a juvenile and you commit a homicide, the process that we go through in the district attorney's office is that we go ahead in every single one of those cases, we go ahead and we seek judicial approval, where a judge will listen to the defense attorney. A judge will oftentimes review from a medical professional and the district attorney's office input before they make the decision and the approval on whether or not to prosecute somebody as an adult. We have violent crimes being committed as juveniles, and we need to be able to hold those individuals accountable, hold individuals who are accountable when they're committing murders and rapes and violent crimes. And we will continue to do that while we are balanced and working with our community partners like Mervyn Brookins and Gina Warren and Sister to Sister to really intervene and prevent the pipeline to prison. Thank you.
I'd like to respond because I did use the words of culture and values. I'd like to respond to that quickly because those are not just buzzwords. What I meant by that, what's the substance behind that, is that when you work with one organization such as Brother to Brother, Sister to Sister, that's a transaction with that organization. So creating a culture and a value means we create it office-wide. If it's good enough for one person in the Brother to Brother Sister program, why isn't it good enough for somebody who lives in Meadowview or Florin or Fruit Ridge or Linden Hill or Citrus Heights or Antelope? So that's what that means. It means that we don't have to rely on just one individual who knows somebody in a community partnership with the DA's office, but that we're looking at this and we're saying, okay, broadly, if this is happening for this individual, it needs to be policy so that we can apply it to everybody. That's fundamentally how you create a fair and just legal system and equal justice for all.
And while we're supposed to stick to our answering the questions, I will allow you to respond.
Thank you.
30 seconds.
When we're talking about, as somebody who's been in the district attorney's office for the last 20 years versus somebody who's not been there for the last 20 years, I can tell you that the culture in the DA's office is one of inclusion. We don't just work with a particular neighborhood. We actually have a post-conviction unit that works with people in Meadowview and in different communities, looking at cases and making sure that we are fair to all communities, not just certain communities. And as somebody who works in the office and has that institutional knowledge versus someone who doesn't, I can attest to the culture that we are working to be inclusive of all different communities and balancing justice, accountability, and fairness to all. And we do that.
Okay, the next question, I believe it's Tim's turn. The state of California has recently moved closer to a zero bail system for misdemeanors and low-level crimes. Supporters of the move say that cash bail is unconstitutional since it unfairly penalizes communities of color. But critics counter that doing away with bail also puts the public at risk. So, what is your view on zero bail and the fairness of bail itself?
First of all, I fundamentally believe that bail shouldn't be based on a person's bank account. It's unfair for a person who is poor to remain in custody while a person who has the financial resources is allowed to bail out. The primary objective of bail pre-trial is to make sure that the person shows up to court, but more than that is public safety. Public safety should be the #1 primary concern when it comes to zero bail. What had happened was in April 2020, the Judicial Council issued what we call zero bail, which is frankly zero supervision for many crimes where somebody commits it, whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony, except for 13 very specific situations. And they're released without essentially supervision and without zero bail. We had 5,000 people released on zero bail during that period of time since COVID started. Of those 5,000, approximately 1,700, there were 1,700 instances of rearrest, including 3 murders and 26 instances of domestic violence. When we're looking at zero bail, we need to look at it in a reasonable and not reckless manner. We need to make sure that we have accountability, that we make sure that when a person is released on zero bail, if they commit a crime, again, that there is bail set. So recently, my office, including myself, approached the court to modify zero bail. And that's what we did to make sure that when somebody is released on zero bail, let's say for an auto burglary, how it worked before was that once they were arrested for that, they could commit another auto burg and another auto burg and another one and another one. And zero bail would be set on each of those. But what we did and what I did in collaboration with the courts was to go ahead and ask that that be modified. So when somebody commits, for example, an offense, and then they commit another offense on zero bail, that bail is actually set so that we can have the court evaluate whether or not this individual is a threat to public safety, so that we can intervene and prevent, violent crimes from occurring, and theft and vandalism and a host of other crimes that have occurred in those 1,700 instances. We should have bail reform, but that needs to be reasonable and not reckless. And it should always be based not on a person's bank account, but on public safety. And that's what we have done, and that's what we will continue to do.
Alana, your views on zero bail and whether the bail system is fair?
So I will say that there's a lot of talk and confusion because we have terms like zero bail, no bail, and cash bail. The fundamental issue, which is, cash bail is unfair. And even the Supreme Court in March in the Embry-Humphrey decision said it is unconstitutional for someone to sit in jail simply because they cannot afford to bail out. And the reason is because it's unfair in our system if a wealthy person who poses a huge risk to society, to public safety, is able to afford to get out, but let someone who has committed a low-level crime and is posing very low or no risk at all has to sit in jail. So that is the fundamental difference. And yes, I agree that we should not have a bail system that is contingent on a person's ability to pay or to bail out. It should be based on public safety. But what I will say and go further is that we need to make sure, in March, I think this county was looking at expanding the jail. And the proponents of that said Sacramento is a high incarceration county, and that's why they needed more millions of dollars to expand it. Knowing that we are a high incarceration county, what needs to happen is that we should start from a place that everyone will be, or not, I shouldn't say everyone, but we will start from the threshold that someone will be released on OR. And then we have a program called pretrial services that allows for a thorough review of a defendant. And if there are any conditions, non-financial conditions that should be a part of their release. So maybe if they have a substance abuse problem, we know that you are a low risk, but you have a problem when you're on this substance that may make you a risk. So you're going to have to be a part of these substance abuse courses. Or if you have mental health issues, you will have to be receiving these services in order. So there can be a number of conditions that can be placed on an individual that's non-financial. Of course, the most serious individuals who pose the greatest risk to society, they should be in custody, and they should have no financial consideration just because the level of harm that they're going to face. What I would also say is it's not just the policy, but it's the practices that we have to guard against and make sure that they are not reckless. So when someone is in the county jail, if they are released, there needs to be a record of why that individual has been released. And it shouldn't be blamed on a policy that is not existent or a police agency that had nothing to do with that. We have to create a clear record. So my position on the bail issue is that it has to be focused again on the threat and the harm that that person poses to our society. But I will also, as DA, advocate for the expansion of the pretrial services to ensure we have a thorough review and evaluation of what are the available options for pre-release conditions that can be imposed on an individual. And if there is nothing that can be done that could ensure that this person is going to be safe in society, then they absolutely should be held and detained. And that is in line with the Humphreys decision and the framework that they have laid out. But then lastly, we need to make sure that we create a clear record so that anyone who is released, we understand who released them and why.
Thank you. And going along with that early release, for years now, the California prison system has been releasing more and more prisoners, whether due to the inability to provide health care for them, COVID-19, the need to reduce budgeting for the state prison system. Is that a wise policy for the state? And what would you do as district attorney to handle the specter of even more early releases?
Well, that's within the purview of the CDCR. That's not within the purview of the district attorney. Although I do know that some district attorneys, and I think in our last debate that we had, this was a question that some, I think DAs had posed is, would I join a lawsuit as other DAs have done? I would not join the lawsuit. I think CDCR understands how they are managing, and that if it's a product of reform, the voters of this country, of this state, and the voters of this county have already spoken on the issue that they support common sense reforms. And so I agree with those voters, and I would make sure that my leadership would be going in the direction that they have showed us time and time again that they want to go. What is in the purview of CDCR and the governor's office is within their purview. So as long as it is not within my purview, if it's something that I have a say in, I will certainly advocate and let my voice be heard, but I don't plan to usurp or try to get political points by stepping into something that is not within the purview of the district attorney's office. I think we have enough concerns with who we are releasing in the Sacramento County jails before I would want to butt into the business of what's going on statewide.
Tim, same question in terms of early releases and how that's handled by the DA's office.
Well, as a district attorney, I'm not going to go ahead and pass the buck. I'm not going to go ahead and say, well, something else is in somebody else's purview and it's their responsibility. It's actually the responsibility of the district attorney to ensure public safety and to ensure justice for all. And that starts not only from the moment that there's not been a case charged, even before that, when you're evaluating a case to see whether or not you're going to charge somebody with a crime, all the way through conviction and even post-conviction, when a person is up for parole. So I'm not going to abdicate my responsibility to victims of crime and say it's somebody else's business. And in fact, what we need to do and look at is really what's happening in our prison system. I'll give you a couple of different examples because I think people understand examples. I prosecuted a particular defendant. He was someone that had raped a 14-year-old. He raped a 14-year-old. He was sentenced to prison for life. And after only doing approximately 14 years, he is now being paroled and recommended for parole. My office opposed it. We appeared at the parole hearing to speak on behalf of the victim. You have somebody down in LA, his name is Sirhan Sirhan. As many of you know, he was convicted of executing and assassinating Senator Robert F. Kennedy. And when it was time for that parole hearing, 6 out of the 9 family members of Robert F. Kennedy, including his widow, opposed parole. But the district attorney of the county that was responsible for appearing at that parole hearing thought that it was better, that it wasn't their role to go ahead and be a voice for the victims, that it wasn't in their purview. And so nobody from the LA County District Attorney's Office showed up. Well, I can tell you that in my office, we have a unit. We have a unit that I oversee that handles parole hearings. And we have a person dedicated to that, where they actually work up the case file. They evaluate it, they consider it. And there have been situations where we have agreed to and grant parole. But there are other situations when we're dealing with serial child molesters, rapists, and murderers that we oppose, and we are that voice, and we will not pass the buck. And policy decisions matter. It's just not about value. It's not about buzzwords. It's about decisions that we make have an impact on public safety, and it has an impact on victims of crime. And we must never forget those victims, because they have felt the true impact of a crime. The fabric of the community has been ripped apart when a crime has occurred, and we need to make sure that those victims, their voices are heard and not silenced. And we will be there every step of the way, from the beginning to the end, because that's our job. That's the oath that we take, and that's an oath that I take seriously.
I just want to add that the way I understood that question is, what do I feel about the releases? So the Department of Corrections makes a determination of who is eligible for release. It's not the DA's office who is making this determination, because we have not been in constant contact with any criminal offender. I do want to set the record straight and say I do not support abandoning victims to have them go to early release or parole hearings by themselves. So we're talking specifically about parole hearings. I think that they can be supported, and they can be supported with advocates. And as long as we have personnel, we're able to do that. Apparently, there's only one person who's available in the DA's office who can do that. So we need to make sure that we're managing our resources well. And we also need to make sure that the people who are in the best position to see the rehabilitation that has occurred, because that's what we want also to keep our community safe, are those are the individuals in the best position to make that determination.
I'll give you a minute to respond.
Again, as someone who's worked in the office for 20 years and someone who oversees that bureau, I can tell you that it isn't just one person. We have one person that is in there, but we have many other people in the office that also conduct parole hearings. When it's your case, you handle the parole hearing, but oftentimes we have other people and staff members that deal with parole hearings, and somebody with the institutional knowledge. And that's why the position of district attorney is so important. You have to have the institutional knowledge of how parole hearings work, how the post-conviction process works. I have that experience, and we have the resources. And when it comes to resources, it comes to a question of, are you willing to dedicate the resources? And the answer to that is yes. We will dedicate. We have dedicated and will dedicate the resources for victims of crime.
Thank you. And this next question is for Tim. Over the decades, I've covered the legislature, a variety of different subjects, and a lot of it is law enforcement and changing the law, some of which benefits the district attorney's office, and some of it which doesn't. And I've seen many cases where a local district attorney or district attorney's group prosecutors would go before the legislature in order to effect a change in law that they don't feel is correct or endangers the public. What would your role be in trying to change public policy in terms of legislation?
Well, I think it's important for any district attorney to work with the policymakers, whether it's the Board of Supervisors, whether it's the City Council, whether it's someone in the Assembly or the Senate. It's important for us to work with our legislature. We have a legislative unit. I am a member of the legislative unit for the California District Attorneys Association. We've worked to propose bills, for example, one such bill that deals with sexually violent predators and their release into the community, trying to write that bill and draft that bill with Assemblyman Jim Cooper from Elk Grove. And what we did there was to give more voice to the community when a sexually violent predator is being released to that community, and to give the community a voice in the placement of that individual. Additionally, we work with Jim Cooper's office in regards to a hate crime bill that increased the punishment in certain situations for hate crime offenses. And that was in the midst of the spike in hate crimes. And so we work with our legislature, we work with our legislators, we work with the Board of Supervisors to institute policies, and we should do that. And we're all partners. after all, in our criminal justice system. And we need to work together on behalf of victims and also ensure that our system of justice is a system that is equitable and fair to all, but at the same time, making sure that the voices of victims are not silenced. In fact, I co-founded a coalition called Voices for Victims. That coalition does advocates on behalf of victims to make sure that when it comes to funding, when it comes to services, when it comes to new legislation, that those victims and victims of violent crime, like I say, have a seat at the table. And not only that, but they have a voice to be heard. And that's what we do, and that's what we should do, and that's what we will continue to do.
Thank you. A lot of the role of the district attorney's office in affecting legislative means to give you more weapons to do your job.
Well, I have experience not only in working with legislatures, but working for the legislatures. I was a chief consultant appointed by the Speaker of the Assembly, and I got to provide oversight of certain policies, programs, and investments made by the state of California dealing with our climate change investments. What I will say is that there's a very complicated process, and it's a very different experience from working on a committee for a lobbying organization that will then go to the legislature and understanding how it works. And what that experience has afforded me is relationships and support of many of our legislative leaders, those who have championed law enforcement, public safety bills that have helped move California forward. It's not only important for the voices of victims to be heard, but it's also important for the voices of voters to be heard. And the voters of California have shown that they are for and support common sense reforms. Those same reforms have been supported by the California Sacramento County voters as well. And when there was a proposition that was on the ballot last year, Proposition 20, which was supported by the other organization my opponent mentioned, and even the current DA in this county, it was to roll back some of the common sense reforms that we have seen. It was rejected not only by the voters of California, but rejected by the voters of Sacramento County. So I think the legislative process is definitely a role for the DA, that they can be a part of that, but they also have to understand that they represent their constituencies. And when their constituencies have shown we want common sense reforms, then the DA ought to support it. I will also say that the role is not only giving input, but you can drive legislation. So while I haven't co-founded an organization of victims, I work with survivors, and I'm not just giving them a voice, I've listened to it. And what they have consistently said is that we need survivor voices, but we also need support of survivor choices. And we have to understand that some people are reluctant to engage in the criminal justice system. Organizations like Voices for Victims are for those who have already engaged with the criminal justice system. But I want to focus on those who are not engaging. They don't have trust. They don't understand. There might be a language barrier. There might be a cultural barrier, and they are still being harmed. And someone has to stand up for them. I've talked with women who are victims of human trafficking, and they had their translator, and they said, "Thank you for seeing me." Because we didn't get caught up in the sting that happens once or twice or however many times they do it a year, but we're still being trafficked. We can't even go to the grocery store because we're afraid that we're going to be kidnapped, and we're invisible. No one is seeing us. I spoke to victims of wage theft who are undocumented in a lot of the communities, and they feel that they're not being heard as well. I've also spoken to sexual assault victims who talked about how they felt like they were nothing but a piece of evidence and not a person. Because all that was important for them in their case through the criminal justice system was whether or not they could get a conviction on the stand. And I want to be a DA who will support legislation that expands victim services. So we move past just looking at punishment and conviction, and we move towards healing and recovery and support. So when there is not a prosecution, those people still have support for healing. And we also want to support legislation that would expand services so people are not engaging with the criminal justice system, they can still receive support and services. Women who are victims of sexual assault may not want to engage in the system, but they may want that documented. And if that is a survivor's choice, we ought to support it. So that's what I would do as DA.
Thank you, Alana. And actually, you anticipated the final question on my list here, and that is prosecutions of crimes don't exist in a vacuum. there are victims of crimes. And the DA's office comes in contact with those victims and is in a unique position to comfort them, support them, and make sure that justice is done. So what would your relationship as DA be with victims, victims' rights groups, family members, loved ones who have been the victims of crimes?
Yes. So being a survivor of crime, as I stated before, in which there was no perpetrator that was held accountable. I did not go through the criminal legal system. It was really up to me to find my own sense of justice. And so I understand and have a heart for those who feel invisible or who feel left out. So I think it's very important. That's a priority. And that's why I think the current approach that we have had and the current policies have not served to make our community safer. And you don't have to take my word for it, because we heard the statistics of how crime has gone up and our communities are not safer. So I have a better approach that is 4 prongs: survivor-centered, accountability-based, public safety-driven, and racially informed. The first part of that is survivor-centered, which means we center the voices of survivors and we make that the top priority. We give them not only an opportunity to have their voices heard, but we give them the opportunity to have their choices honored. The other part of the relationship that I think we owe to survivors of crime is actually understanding how we can support them. There's been a rise and increase, but there's been a rise and increase of violence against women. So we have to understand the dynamics and we have to understand the trauma. As DA, I would want to make sure that we have trauma-informed care. I just recently coordinated a training where we train prosecutors and victim advocates and investigators on how to have trauma-informed communication. So you can't say things like, everything's going to be all right. No, you don't know that everything is going to be all right. And secondly, we don't know the experiences that everyone has. It requires a certain level of cultural sensitivity and understanding bias for our trans community, because for a lot of trans women of color, when they come into an office, they may not even be identified by their preferred gender pronoun. So I would also make sure we have a gender inclusive policy where we ask individuals, how would you like to be addressed? What are your pronouns? I think it's most important that we not only listen to survivor voices, but we incorporate them. So I would have a victims advisory board to understand how can we better serve them, but more in particular, more specifically, how can we serve and engage those who don't report crimes? Those are the people who are being lost, who are being left behind, because we have just normalized crime to certain communities and normalized it against certain types of victims. So I want to make sure we build those relationships. I want to make sure that we leverage those relationships and that we ensure equal justice and protection for all survivors.
Thank you. And Tim, again, the district attorney's role in supporting crime victims and loved ones of crime victims.
Most definitely. We've advocated for victims of crime again and again, whether it's through the Coalition Voices for Victims, whether it's through Victim Awareness Week. We have over a dozen victim advocates that work at the district attorney's office. You know, there are comments that make about we have normalized crime in the community. For the district attorney's office, we have not normalized crime. We continue to fight crime and continue to fight on behalf of victims. Like I said, we have over a dozen victim advocates in the office, and what they do is they go ahead and they do in fact use trauma-informed care. They do care for the victims. They attend court with the victims. Even if court never happens, we are reaching out to victims, providing services with the Victim Compensation Board. We are providing services so that they can get money to bury their loved ones, to get counseling and treatment. There's no requirement that we have a criminal case to do it, but yet we continue to do it, but it doesn't get advertised. It doesn't get talked about because we just do that job because we care about victims and we continue to care about victims. I've worked with many victims over the year. I've worked with Nicole Clavel. Nicole Clavel runs the Sacramento Crime Prevention Unit. And I worked with her because her son, JJ Clavel, was murdered in a drive-by shooting, in a gang shooting when he was on his way to play in a football game at Grant High School. It was a playoff game. And he was shot by a gang member in the street, murdered in cold blood, and another person in the car was shot as well. I've worked with Nicole Clavel. I've worked with victims in the East Area rapist case again and again, but so many other victims, those that have reported crimes, those that have not reported crimes. Why? because we need to support victims of crime. And the policies that undermine victims' rights, whether it's not filing in gang enhancements, whether it's not prosecuting juveniles as adult in certain serious situations, whether it's not, prosecuting those individuals and holding them responsible, okay, those have affected victims of crime. And in this district attorney's office, in the Sacramento District Attorney's office, we prosecute gang enhancements, we prosecute and seek life offenses on those that are child molesters and serial rapists. And we do so in a way that is equitable to the defendant, but at the same time, we make sure that we listen to the victim and we care for them and we defend them in the courtroom and outside the courtroom. And we continue to do that because the focus should always be on public safety and to the victim.
Thank you. That concludes our question and answer period. And now we'll go to closing statements of 3 minutes each. And Tim, I think you can go first.
Daniel Webster once said, "Justice is the greatest interest of humanity." When my grandmother was executed by the communists in Vietnam without a trial, without a judge, without a prosecutor present, my family learned the meaning of injustice. When my uncle was taken away into a re-education camp after the fall of South Vietnam, my family felt the pain of injustice. When we escaped Vietnam on a fishing boat and drifted without food or water near death, we felt the despair of injustice. After being rescued and taken to a refugee camp, we waited for justice. After coming to this country and feeling the warm air of freedom along the shores of America, we, for the first time in a long time, felt a new justice. As a prosecutor, I have fought and will fight for justice. I fought to get justice for Nicole Clavel and JJ Clavel. I fought for justice for Chris Pedretti, who was raped by the East Area Rapist and now appears on TV and appears on different programs to really inform not only prosecutors and law enforcement and the legislator and the community about sexual assault. I fought to get justice for Lily Manning, who was beaten and tortured by her parents with a hammer and a wooden board. I fought for justice for Brian and Katie Majori, who were killed by a serial killer when they were walking down the street on a quiet evening. I fought for justice for Rajneet Singh, who was assaulted and strangled in Rancho Cordova. But I will fight for justice for all communities that have been ravaged by violent crimes, ravaged by intergenerational trauma and toxicity. Justice belongs to Lemon Hill, to Meadowview, to CV Circle, to East Bidwell, and to East Sac and South Sac. It belongs to all people and all communities. And I have the experience in the courtroom, in the community, in the classroom, and in the executive room to be the next district attorney, so that I make sure that we provide safety to all communities and equal justice to all. Thank you.
Thank you. And Alana, 3 minute closing statement.
So we just heard a list of names of individuals who there's been someone to fight for justice for them. But I'm running for Sacramento County District Attorney because there's so many more who they had no one to fight for justice for them. People like Taylor Blackwell, who unfortunately there was no DNA testing to find out what happened to her when she was found deceased in a South Sacramento hotel. Or justice for Soraya Jade, the daughter of Jimmy Rodriguez, who was shot in the head, and nobody has come forward to give any information. And she continues to walk around North Sacramento trying to do the best that she can. It's time for new leadership because the pursuit of justice currently under the process and the policies of the Sacramento County DA's office is not serving all communities. It's time for new leadership, and I have the broad and diverse experience to effectively meet the moment we are facing right now. I have the experience to face this moment, to bring safety to all Sacramento County residents and to alleviate the distrust in the system. This moment requires more than experience of trying cases that made the headlines. It requires being on the front line and having that experience, that perspective, and that understanding. I've been on the front lines as a survivor of violent crime. And as your next DA, I will work to center all survivor voices and honor survivor choices to promote healing and recovery, even when there's no prosecution. I've been on the front lines of public policy as a public policy expert and executive leader. And as your next DA, I will manage resources to prioritize the most serious and violent crimes, increase transparency, and work just as hard to reduce crime as I will to prosecute it. I've been on the front lines as a community leader who doesn't have to work to build bridges or be the bridge, because for the entirety of my legal career, I have been the bridge. I've been the bridge as a deputy DA, mentoring women on parole and at-risk youth. I've been the bridge as the public advisor, the public attorney of the California Energy Commission, facilitating highly contentious public meetings where I chose to lean in and work with angry, upset, vulnerable communities to come up with solutions instead of shutting them down or shutting them out. I've been the bridge as a law professor, not just teaching my students, but designing a course that connected them to the community, where I worked with public health advocates on 911 alternatives for mental health and substance abuse crisis. I've worked with the NAACP. I've assisted grassroots organizations become more informed, and I've worked with the Sacramento Housing Alliance on addressing newly homeless barriers and the affordability for those at risk of becoming homeless. I'm not the candidate who will tell you what I plan to do to tackle the challenges for our county. I'm the candidate who's already doing it. Lastly, as your next DA, I will be the bridge to a more safe, fair, and just future.
Well, thank you very much to both candidates. It's been a pleasure to listen to your views, and it's one thing to put out campaign literature, but out to hear your policies presented is a real treat for us. I think I speak with a lot of folks in saying this is an exciting time, because no matter who wins, we'll have a district attorney of color to represent our various communities here in Sacramento. So I wish you both good luck. And I want to thank the four organizations that sponsored this particular forum, and they re-emphasize the importance of people to go out there and vote. The API community is a growing voting force in this county, as it will statewide and nationally. So it's very important for us to get out and vote in June and choose the person of your choice. And obviously, the four organizations will sponsor other candidates forums for different offices as we move along. And once again, good luck to both the candidacies, and we look forward to hearing and seeing more of you, whether you win or lose. So again, my name is Lonnie Wong. Thanks again for attending. Thank you all the people who came on board with us on Zoom, and it was recorded, and it will be put on the APAPA Facebook site for reviewing, and to refer your friends and other voters to again listen to both of these fine candidates. Thank you.